Eli here, yada yada, you know the drill. Great. Now that we've got that out of the way, I'd like to start with holy shit. Holy shit, y'all. Holy fucking shit. Let me elaborate. Right after I wrote up my last story, I posted it, and then I opened up a new document in Microsoft Word. Mostly because I like to leave a document open all the time and type my thoughts into it. A virtual journal of sorts. It helps me process things and think through my feelings. I like to imagine it as self-led therapy. Considering my fragile mental state, it clearly doesn't solve everything, but it certainly doesn't make things any worse. Anyway, all this to say that I had a Word document open like I usually do. And like I often do, I left the room before typing anything to get a snack. And when I returned, that's where the holy shit comes in. Because guys, there was writing on the page. It said this. Sorry, can't talk. Might be noticed. Would be taken away. Can type. Don't say anything. And no, it wasn't a ghost or invisible monster or something, because guess who is sitting right next to the keyboard, his fluffy tail curled around his feet, staring at me with his intelligent eyes. If you guessed Mr. Bailey, well, first of all, it wasn't that hard based on my last sentence, but also, you'd be right. That's correct, friends. Holy shit, because Mr. B apparently, 1, understood me when I tried to set up a communication system, 2, can, in fact, communicate, but won't do it verbally because it, quote, might be noticed, 3, knows something about us being listened to and or watched, and 4, to reiterate, can basically fucking talk. Now, his words on the document said not to say anything in response, and damn, I can't tell you how hard I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying that string of holy shits out loud. I think I'll have a dent in my tongue for the rest of my life. Somehow I managed, and I sat down at my computer and I typed back. It took him longer to respond since he essentially walked across the keyboard to type, stepping precisely on certain keys. And then I had to wait for him to finish, letter by letter, until I could respond. It only took a few back and forths for me to realize that this was wildly inefficient. So I gestured for him to wait. Then we ventured out to that utterly decimated Best Buy and scavenged in the broken glass and bodies until we found another keyboard. Did you guys know that you can hook up 2 keyboards into one computer, and once it calibrates, the computer can accept input from both of them nearly simultaneously? Well, you can. And that's what I did. So now Mr. Bailey has his own keyboard, and we can type back and forth with less waiting and transition time. Now, I bet you're all wondering what he said. I have his permission to post part of our conversation here. I saved the Word document, obviously, because it's not every freaking day your cat begins to talk to you. So I'll post some direct fragments. I'm also going to relay a story he typed out for me, but I'm going to edit and dramatize it, because it took him forever to type it out, and even then he only used sentence fragments and I pieced the details together. I think he'd like a more polished version of that part. He meowed in agreement as he read that over my shoulder. A few things before I continue my Mr. Bailey extravaganza post. First of all, isn't my cat the coolest thing in existence? Like, seriously. I thought he was the best before, but now I'm pretty damn sure there's no animal cooler than him in the entire world. Can your pet talk and use a computer? No? Didn't think so. Guess Mr. B is cooler. Sorry, I don't make the rules. Second, he knows surprisingly good English. I assume from reading over my shoulder as I write journal entries to myself or stories to share with you guys, and from listening to me talk. I know you didn't hear that, but he meowed in agreement to that too. But he doesn't really use capital letters or punctuation other than periods, except when Word edits stuff automatically, so don't criticize his grammar when I include direct quotes, okay? I mean, he's pretty self-confident with a healthy ego, but no one likes unhelpful criticism over the internet. And he's a motherfucking cat who can type, so give him a break. Third, I think this ties in well to rule number 10. If you guessed that's another general rule rather than a specific monster-oriented one, you'd be correct. Rule number 10. Not everything is as it seems. Don't trust everything you see or hear, and don't judge a book by its cover. Yes, I know, a tired cliche. And you're also probably like, Eli, isn't that rule covered in the Ashley rule or the MJ rule? Well, both yes and no, and also, shut up. Those rules deal specifically with the food created by Ashley's or the humans imitated by MJ's. Rule number 10 is simply a more general version with a broader scope, and it encompasses a lot more things. For instance, screams in the distance? Could be human, but probably not. Probably monsters fighting and or trying to draw people out, so don't trust it. Dead bodies in the street? Probably human corpses, but if they're not pretty rotten by now, maybe not. MJs have been known to play dead to get you to come closer to them, so don't trust them. Purple flowers in the ground? Might be actual flowers, but might be the eyes of a Sandra. No, seriously, I almost stepped on one once because it was camouflaged and laying on the ground. I barely got my earplugs in before it was on its feet and singing. That was a close call. Don't trust them. And yes, a cat that seems smarter and acts not quite like a cat, maybe not 100% a normal cat. Still a cat, not a monster, but not a normal cat. So without further ado, here's the first part of our conversation directly from that document, with minor edits for clarity. Mr. Bailey. Sorry, can't talk. Might be noticed. Would be taken away. Can type. Don't say anything. Eli, after freaking out silently for several minutes. So you can talk? You understand me? Mr. Bailey. Yes. Eli, but you waited this long to talk to me? Mr. Bailey. Didn't always know how. Learned from listening and watching you. Eli. Cool. But you don't want a system of meowing because you, quote, might be noticed? Mr. Bailey. Yes. Eli. Well, that's great. Who might notice and why would they take you away? Mr. Bailey. Don't know who, but they always listen. Sometimes watch too. Eli. What do you mean? How? Are they watching now? Mr. Bailey. Listening devices in dome. Can hear everything. Cameras and monsters in some buildings. Not this building. Always listen. Sometimes watch. Eli. How do you know that? Mr. Bailey. Can hear them whirring and clicking. Hear them transmit in dome. Hear them under monster skin. At this point, I told him he was a badass, and then asked for significantly more clarification and details because, as you can imagine, my head was fucking spinning so hard it was going into orbit. I won't directly relay the rest of the somewhat repetitive conversation, but here's the gist. Mr. B thinks there are audio transmitters all over the dome, too tiny to see, that relay any noise in the entire dome back to whoever is running this shit show. There aren't cameras in the dome, at least as far as he can tell, but there are cameras spread out around the city, and in almost every monster. He first noticed something weird pretty early on when he heard clicking, like a camera shutter opening and closing, in a dead monster body, and some investigation and focused listening led him to hear the same sound in almost every monster we've ever come across, which is a really comforting realization. Once he realized the sound their cameras make, he listened for it everywhere. The house I was staying in before this one had cameras, and he wanted me to leave. Looking back, it makes sense. We only stayed there for 2 weeks because he was constantly freaking out and driving me crazy. At the time, I thought he didn't like a smell or something, but I guess he was acting like a psycho and on purpose in order to get me out of there. When we got to this neighborhood, he thoroughly examined every inch of the house before settling in, and I thought that was just him doing his normal cat thing. But no. He was checking for cameras. What a little goddamn genius. That's why typing is safer than some kind of meowing system. He's worried if they know he's onto them, they'll come after him, or maybe both of us. Maybe they'll decide whatever sick game they're playing should come to an end and just fucking apocalypse us. He just doesn't know, so he figured he should play it safe. I support that, because I too would like to make it out of here alive. That was my New Year's resolution after all, and I intend to keep it. I'd love to go to a functioning restaurant again before I die, if nothing else. And before you panic about my posts being monitored too, don't worry. I hide my IP address and use different VPNs. I figured out how to do all that before I even started posting, because I had theories about being watched, and I didn't want to risk my stories being seen by the assholes controlling all this. Not to mention the internet and cell service are so shitty that maybe it hasn't even occurred to them that I'm trying to communicate outside the dome. And maybe they're not checking. Who knows? Depends how dumb they are. I hope they're dumb. All this to say that posting here should be pretty safe, but thanks for your concern. There was also a lot of conversation about how he came to be, well, a little more than your average cat. Now is the time for me to relay that story. Just like with my own stories, let me take you back. This time, all the way back, to the very first day this all happened, aka the day I saw my family torn apart in front of me, aka the day I don't want to relive, but I'm okay with reliving from Mr. Bailey's view. This part of his story all took place before we crossed paths anyway. It probably happened while I was seeing my family torn apart in front of me, come to think of it, but I'm not going to think of that little detail. You may remember that I fled to the pet store and found Mr. Bailey the night this all started. That leaves about 10 hours between the descent of the monsters and our meeting. During those 10 hours, a lot of shit went down. I mean, seriously. I know I've used the term all hell broke loose several times, but this was the original hell breaking loose. The big one. The one where hell may as well have actually opened up all its doors and let out its demons, because things went south about as quickly as I imagined they would with demons running around. It was about noon when the dome appeared. I don't know if it descended or rose from the ground or fucking shimmered into existence, because I didn't see it happen, and whatever it did fast. Mr. Bailey doesn't know either. Like any normal weekday, he was inside the pet store, dozing on a cat bed up on a shelf. Then the monsters appeared. No one knows exactly where they came from either, but it was chaos. Bloody, horrific chaos. None of us had ever seen any of those monsters before, obviously, so none of us knew how to fight them. Hell, I'm pretty sure most of the population didn't believe in monsters until they were being eaten by them. I'm not going into detail right now about the terrors I witnessed because this isn't my story. Also because I don't want to. My self-therapy isn't good enough to make me want to discuss my family's death or rule number 1 yet. Stay tuned to see if my mental health improves or plummets. Only time will tell. Mr. Bailey remembers vague bits and pieces of the first few minutes. People running by the store screaming, unfamiliar creatures that smelled like death chasing them, sounds of bones crunching and claws ripping into flesh. The store owner panicked when he saw what was happening. Who wouldn't? But instead of trying to hide, he hadn't been noticed in the empty little store yet. He decided to make a run for it. His car was right out front after all, literally 10 steps from the door. He called Mr. Bailey to come, and though he was scared and confused, Mr. B listened. This was his owner. The man had raised and cared for Mr. Bailey since he was a kitten, and Mr. B loved him. He wasn't about to abandon him now. The store owner grabbed his keys and raced for his car, Mr. B at his side. They made it inside, but not much further. As the owner put his keys in the ignition, the car shook, and an awful half-growl, half-screech that would come to be recognizable as the distinctive sound of a Caleb surrounded them. A Caleb appeared at the driver's side, and neither of them had time to react before it smashed its fist through the window. The owner tried to shove it away, but if that tactic worked, well, there'd be a lot more people still alive. The Caleb started scratching and clawing at anything it could reach, which happened to be the owner's chest and arms. Long slashes blossomed across his torso, and blood flew as both the owner and the Caleb flailed, painting the windshield red. And Mr. P couldn't stand by and watch. He always was braver than most cats, and at that moment he was pissed off, scared, and threatened by the monster attacking the person he loved. That was enough for him to leap across his owner and latch himself onto the Caleb, digging his claws in. The Caleb shrieked, probably more surprised than hurt, and stumbled backwards. As it swung its long arms trying to grab Mr. B, he clawed his way up the Caleb's chest to its head. And then he just started scratching and biting any piece of the Caleb near him. Skull, arms, face. The Caleb almost got a hold of him a couple times, but Mr. B held on for dear life and clawed its hands enough to make it temporarily draw back. Then Mr. B, mostly by chance, struck gold. In his flurry of teeth and claws, he happened to stick a paw in one of the Caleb's eye sockets. And since it was already there, he started scratching the ever-living shit out of the empty hole where an eye should be. Maybe not quite as good as a laser, but it was effective enough. Smoke began to exude from the eye hole. The Caleb shrieked and flailed wildly, apparently so distraught by the pain that its swinging arms didn't even come close to knocking Mr. B off. It seemed to be working, and Mr. B's paw was twisted at a weird angle and hard to pull out anyway, so he just kept scratching around in the eye socket. Thank God he did. The Caleb staggered backwards, still shrieking, until its heels hit the curb and it fell hard onto its back, Mr. B still holding on tight. Luckily, he was more on its face than the back of its head by this point. I say luckily because when the Caleb hit the concrete, it hit hard enough to crack its skull open. Mr. B was splashed with thick purple Caleb blood and little bits and chunks of Caleb brain. Yes, they apparently do have a brain, but let's not dwell on that surprise. He finally withdrew his claws and stepped off the dead Caleb, giving himself several quick licks to smooth his fur and remove at least a little of the mess. He looked over to his owner, who was still sitting in the car, bleeding profusely but alive. He had been watching, and when Mr. B emerged victorious, his terrified and pained expression turned to a smile. He looked at Mr. Bailey and said, "You saved my life, Mr. B. You're the best goddamn cat there ever was. Come on, get back here. We gotta get out of here." And Mr. Bailey understood him for the first time. He stood there on the curb for a second, trying to make sense of how he knew what a human was saying, and he stood there a second too long. Suddenly another Caleb was leaping over the car from its passenger side. Mr. Bailey let out a yell, but it was too late. The Caleb was already at the broken driver's side window, and Mr. B's owner was caught off guard. Mr. B was still much too far away to help when he heard the scream and a horrible ripping noise. He couldn't see what had happened with the Caleb in between him and the car, but he saw more blood spray across the windshield, and he listened to the scream cut off, and he knew it was over. He kept going, though, because he was hoping to get revenge. He took a flying leap and landed on the Caleb's back, clawing it and yowling in fury as he tried to reach its head, since he had now put together that its eye was a weak point. He wasn't sure why he was thinking so much more distinctly than he ever had, but now wasn't the time to question it. Unfortunately, this Caleb was apparently more flexible, because it managed to reach its long arms around, grab him, and fling him off before he ever got to the top of that nasty Caleb summit. He landed on the curb near the dead Caleb, and the alive Caleb started to walk over to him, making its awful noise. Mr. B thought he was done for. He probably would have been, except there was a scream from the street. Both Mr. Bailey and the Caleb turned to see a woman, fleeing from what would eventually come to be known as a Brent. Luckily for Mr. Bailey, but not so luckily for the woman, the Caleb decided she was more appealing, and it turned and sprinted after her, leaving Mr. Bailey laying on the curb, out of breath but unwounded. The only evidence that Mr. B had tried to get his revenge was a series of crazed claw marks down its back. Mr. Bailey made himself go look at his owner briefly. His head had been torn off, and he was sitting on the passenger seat. He sat there a moment and paid his respects, but then he couldn't bear to look at it anymore, and he went back inside. At this point, Mr. Bailey was devastated, but he was also confused and intrigued, because he was suddenly seeing everything differently than he ever had before. He was thinking in a way that he assumed humans usually thought, and he swore he could read a few of the words printed on food bags and toys around the shop. His empty food bowl was printed with Mr. Bailey, and he was pretty sure that was his name. It was a, quote, weird process, his words, that he doesn't think he can adequately explain to humans who have always had that capacity for thought and logic, but he would like to emphasize that it was very strange and very confusing. Yet it also provided a distraction from the fact that he had just failed to save his owner. So he thought about it, and looked down at his brain and blood-covered fur, and came up with his theory. He swallowed Caleb flesh and blood while attacking it. He knows he did, because he bit it anywhere he could reach, and he was in too much of a frenzy to worry about spitting anything out. Then he was splashed with its brains, and during his quick wash he suspects he ingested more blood and at least a few small pieces of the brain. It's all only his theory, of course, but it's the best one he has, and I sure don't have anything better, so I'm on board. It seems like something he swallowed, the flesh, the blood, the brains, or some combination of the three, made him more than your average cat. He says he was thrilled when I got there a couple hours later. He remembered me from my visits to the store when I was younger. He was scared and lonely too, and he wasn't sure what he was going to do in the following days. Me walking in changed that. I told him how much he comforted me that first night, and he said I comforted him too. I guess I never realized that we'd both lost our families that day. As for the Caleb that killed his owner, don't worry. Apparently it stuck around the area, because it was the same Caleb that attacked me in the pet shop the very next morning, and therefore the same one I killed by discovering the magic of laser pointers. Mr. B recognized it when it charged at me. He saw the claw marks on its back. And you know the rest. He helped me take it down, and it was not only his revenge, but the start of a beautiful monster-killing partnership. Anyway, rule number 10. Things aren't always what they seem. He may not just be a cat, but he sure is pretty great. I have a conversation partner now, too, kind of, as long as we're careful. Beats writing a journal to myself. I'm worried about the monitoring shit, obviously, but that's a problem for after I share this post. To end the Mr. Bailey extravaganza, I will say this. I love him. I'm glad we have each other. He's a badass. I'll let him reply to strangers on the internet if he really wants to, because he deserves it. And yes, I may really feel all those things, but you can bet your ass he encouraged me to type them.